We are grateful to our friends at Northshire Books and Monroe Street Books for their underwriting of this program. Northshire Books has outlets in Manchester, Vermont, and Saratoga Springs, and Monroe Street Books is on Route 7 just north of Middlebury. Both are wonderful independent bookstores, and we thank them. Hello, I'm Louis Meyers, and welcome to Meet the Author, where I am truly honored today to have with us, from his home in Dorset, England, via Zoom, Mr. Jon Lee Anderson. Mr. Anderson is an American author and journalist who began his career in the early 1980s reporting on Central America's civil wars. He spent 3 years in Cuba and wrote a biography of Che Guevara. As a New Yorker staff writer, I've been reading him for many, many years, his long form. Since 1998, he has reported from Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon, Somalia, Angola, Congo, Liberia, Brazil, Cuba, Venezuela, Sri Lanka, and many other countries. He has gone where angels fear to tread. Mr. Anderson has profiled a number of international public figures. He has won several awards for his reporting, including the prestigious George Polk Award, the Maria Moores Cabot, and several Overseas Press Club awards, among others. So I'm truly grateful and honored to have Mr. Anderson with us today.
Thank you, Louis. Lovely to be with you.
We're going to be talking predominantly today about Mr. Anderson's book, To Lose a War, The Fall and Rise of the Taliban. This came out several years ago after the United States left Afghanistan. It's a compilation of a number of his long-form reporting from Afghanistan over 20-year period. It includes a new preface and an afterword looking at the events that took place as the United States left. So we're going to talk predominantly about Afghanistan, but I want to step back and ask you a more general question about what led you to become a foreign correspondent covering foreign wars and other issues. I know that looking at Wikipedia, that you, growing up, traveled, you and your family of origin were in many places around the world. Can you tell us a little bit about your early years?
Sure. Yes. I mean, well, I was about to say, I think it had a lot to do with my childhood. My father was a U.S. Foreign Service officer, agricultural specialist, I think, as opposed to a CIA agent, supposedly. My mother was a children's book author. They were pretty progressive people as well, and we traveled the world. I lived very little in the United States. I'm one of 5 kids. They also adopted kids from different cultures. So we were also a multicultural family. We lived in Taiwan, Korea, Indonesia, Colombia, and England. And then when I was a teenager, I started seeking independence myself. And they allowed me to live for a year in Liberia with an uncle and travel in Africa. Later, I did the same in Central America as a young teenager. And so, you know, I guess I sort of ran with what was the family pathology, which was feeling like the world was something that I belonged in. I didn't feel comfortable in the United States. The first year we came back to live in the United States, it coincided with the murders, first of Martin Luther King and then of Robert F. Kennedy. Both of them were figures of veneration in my family's household. So it was with a real feeling of tragedy that not long after RFK's death, we then moved abroad again to Indonesia, and I really didn't want to return to the United States. And it set off a kind of pattern of behavior in which I ran away when we returned, and thus my family's solution was to send me to West Africa with an uncle. That in turn set off its own pathology because I didn't want to come back and I wanted to replicate that experience again and again. And long story short, by the time I was 17 or 18, I had a kind of twin mission. One was to to experience the original world as much as I could through, as I saw it, adventure. I wanted to be a kind of an explorer, and I wanted to witness history in my time. And I think the convergence of those two interests, those overriding interests of mine, together with to some degree, my parents' restraining hands, but also facilitating hands. And in the case of my mother, encouraging me to be creative, to try to write, led me eventually to becoming a reporter, at which, allowed me to eventually, make a living doing what I wanted to do, which was to live life to the max,
You most
places I
certainly
wanted to
have,
go.
and we're going to talk about that. That's some of those experiences. Did you? I mean, it's remarkable that you were traveling on your own as a young teenager through Central America. Did you have much in the way of formal schooling?
Oh yeah. I went to I think 11 schools. Um, one time I was in three schools in one year. You can see that my educational upbringing was pretty fraught in that sense. I was always the new guy. I had to get used to. I had to be very adaptive and to change frequently. I usually went to international schools, although my parents were great believers in immersion in local culture, and at times they put us in local schools as well. So at various moments, I was thrust into different linguistic environments, Mandarin speakers, Swahili, Spanish, Bahasa. The only one that really stuck with me because I sought it out again was Spanish. But I had formally speaking the usual education, but it was a bit it wasn't the usual one. And I didn't finish high school, which doesn't mean to say I dropped out. I was moved into the English system, and then so in a sense, I don't have a high school diploma. And then after a couple of years in Central America, my family sort of forced me to go to college, and I did 2 years in college before going off to lead expeditions in South America. So, and I never returned. Yeah. So
You,
I'm probably the least educated New Yorker writer that exists.
that that
Formally.
may well be true, and you wear that proudly. You live in Dorset, England now. I should have mentioned with your wife, and you have three grown children. Dorset, England, I guess, is more settled and perhaps less violent place than many places in the world you've found yourself. What is it like to be living in a somewhat calmer environment?
Yeah. Well, I guess it's sort of equivalent to Vermont, but without the guns. Um, Dorset is a place that my family came to live in when I was 15. And again, it was a completely foreign environment. We were the only outsiders in the little town where we moved to along this coast, a place called Lyme Regis, just down the coast from where I live today, Bridport. But the woman who I eventually married was my sweetheart at the time, and we sought each other out, despite the fact that I moved on after 2 years. My family effectively broke up when I was in England. She and I sought each other out over the years, and I eventually hunted her down and married her. And so we started out in London, then Oxford, and later went to Cuba and Spain. But um, around the time our children were, 7, 9, and 11, we realized that they had been entirely educated in Spanish, sorry, and were speaking a kind of Spanglish. So we thought we would come to England because it was closer from Spain to give them an experimental year in our language. And it coincided with 9/11. I went off to Afghanistan, didn't come back for months, and basically we just ended up staying. Um, I don't have a kind of embargo against the US. I go there often. I even went and sort of set up shop there in Trump's first term. out of a feeling that I was an expat and I'd never had that feeling before, and out of a sense of alarm that my native country was succumbing to kind of despotism. And I actually, maintained a household there and here for 2 years, but that wasn't very practical. So, I go through it a lot. I have a brother and a sister who live in the States, another in France. So, I go there frequently. Um, but yes, Britain is, although I'm not a Brit, is the place I live. And it's definitely a sanctuary from the world I usually report on.
Sanctuaries are probably much needed. And let's talk about your career as a foreign correspondent. It's clear from everything you've just said that it's understandable how you may have become a foreign correspondent. You probably weren't going to be sitting at a desk covering the Labor Department somewhere. But um, what kind of people, if you could characterize, become foreign correspondents?
It's a good question. And to be honest, I'm not sure I've ever been asked that, but it's a good question. I think roughly they fit in, if thinking of Americans, but maybe it applies to other nationalities, they fit into probably a couple of broad categories. They're the kind of corporate journalists, institutionalists who, a bit like people who go and work for the State Department, who have learned their craft and then are hired because they're good, because they're smart, or because they went to the right school, maybe a combination of all of the above. And they work for one of the major media institutions, whether newspaper, television, or radio. And some fall into foreign correspondentship by fluke because they got sent on a major story somewhere. But there's a fair number of them that have it in their bones to be foreign correspondents, that want to cover, a bit like I was saying I did, to be there in the first line of history, and witnessing the history of their time. There's a certain amount of glamour, of course, that comes with it, that seduces people as well. This idea that you can gallivant around the world wearing a scarf and with a retinue you know, of people at your beck and call. The idea of a dangerous life is somehow romantic. It's been written up in books, boys on adventures, since for a couple of centuries now, and it's also the stuff of movies. So I think, again, I've sort of diverged, but I've said kind of people who are just doing the job, and some do the White House, some do the Labor Department, like you said, and some, are drawn to the idea of the international arena. And then there's some who go in it for the glamour. There's always people who say, "Are you an adrenaline junkie?" And I would say I'm not, but I do like to live life. I like to know that I'm living it. I don't want to feel overly coddled or particularly comfortable. It's boring to me. I feel like one stagnates if things are just a bit too easy. And then there's another category, Louis, I would say, who are sort of freelancers, people who do this because they really are adventurers. They want to just live their lives. They're a bit like, if you were comparing them to horses, they're like wild Mustangs. They just want to be out there on the free range. And if I had to total up that sort of crowd, I would call them the tribe. They're the people I know. We run into each other in conflicts, occasionally in conferences, but usually it's in some conflict over the years, over dozens of years in some cases, the same people. And it's a handful, it's not many. Some have died. There's been some attrition. But there's a handful, more than a handful. There's about 3 or 4 or 5 handfuls of these people from various nationalities who thrill to be at the cutting edge of history, damn the consequences, and um, and that's the life they want to live. I, is it comparable to say people who do other dangerous things like firefighting or maybe Formula One drivers? Maybe there's something in it, but usually they're more idiosyncratic than that. They are people with a, a large sense of history. They have a romantic attachment to history, I think, and to life. And yeah, it's the life they want to live.
A movie, and I don't know if you saw it, called A Private War, about Marie Colvin, who you may have known. Marie Colvin was actually an American who was one of the chief foreign correspondent for the London Times, won a number of awards, went to cover the war. She was lost an eye in Sri Lanka to gunfire or shrapnel, where you were as well. She was in Iraq, and then went to Syria in 2012 during the spring uprisings, and Bashir al-Assad's military intelligence tracked her down in Homs and killed her. And the movie, I thought, Rosamund Pike plays her, Marie Colvin, incredibly well. Displays a woman who had multiple motivations. I think there is clearly what you've just said, wants to be in the immediacy of history. There was certainly some adrenaline. There was competitiveness with her other journalists out there. And then there was a desire to help people. And ultimately, according to the movie, that may have led to her death. She would not leave people who were trapped in the bombing at Homs. So it was a whole mixture of motivations. And I suspect from what you've just said that is not uncommon.
No, I mean, I knew Marie not well. We met a few times in different places, and I respected her hugely. She was very brave, a bit crazy brave, if you know what I mean. I think those of us who didn't know her knew that that was an aspect to her. She took chances beyond the normal. You know, I know that it sounds to the average person probably nuts that you go off to a war zone, and to be in a country where there is war may seem dangerous enough. But once you're there, for most of us, there are ways to be safer. There's ways to protect yourself. There are roads you don't go down, places you don't stay. You have a sixth sense about what could be a fatal decision or not at the best of times. And Marie continuously put herself into imminent harm's way in a way that other people didn't. When she died, I was not surprised. And I say this, with respect, of course, because as I say, she is someone I respected and I liked. I had flown to Beirut 2 days before with other friends because another friend of ours, Anthony Shadid of the New York Times, had just died leaving Syria, where he had been with rebel forces. And our friend Tyler Hicks had basically carried him out. He died of an asthma attack. It was a real tragedy. We attended his funeral, and literally the next morning, we're in a hotel feeling, in mourning, and watched Syrian television to see that Marie and another young lad that I also knew, Rene Oshlik, had just been killed in Homs. And it was terrible. And it was just the beginning, in a way, of a whole string of deaths, some of them more brutal than others, including friends that were executed by ISIS, that happened in those years, and that caused some of the attrition I was talking about. Marie, it's not surprising that there's a movie made of her. She took very little care for herself and had a great deal of luck, and was, a larger than life person. And yes, the tribe is made up of people like that.
The one time we have met, and I'm sure you don't remember this, but it was about 20-some years ago in Washington, D.C. at the wonderful independent bookstore Politics and Prose. And I think you were doing a reading, and I can't remember which book. But the question I asked on that time was, what was the scariest situation for you when you were out in the field? And I remember all these years, I've remembered what you said. You said a teenager holding an AK-47.
Yeah, that's one of them. Yeah. Kids with guns, you know, they're dangerous. Once I asked a Nicaraguan Contra guerrilla, well, he was telling me actually about how they were targeting people in villages held then by the then Sandinista government for execution. And he explained that, they were looking for certain types of people, the mayors or head people in the village, school teachers, those who had acquired the enemy's ideology. And it was a moment of candor. And I said, well, how do you kill them? And he said, we use the 14-year-olds. And I said, what do you mean? He says, yeah, we make them dig their graves and they usually beat them to death. And I said, oh my God, that's horrific. Why do you use the kids, the youngest recruits? And they said, because they haven't earned a conscience yet. And that always stayed with me. And later on, in Africa, where you had the whole phenomenon, not only Africa, but the many of the child soldiers that began, the kind of savagery of conflicts like Liberia or Sierra Leone and others, where this phenomena of the boys of the child soldier around the world, the implacable young killer, really became a phenomenon in the 80s and 90s and until today. And of course, I have run into them over the years here and there. And they are definitely the most dangerous of all because, very often they've been brutalized into becoming killers, and they're in a kind of fever. Sometimes they're also drugged. So yeah, the younger they are, the more dangerous it is because, as that man said to me so many years ago, they haven't yet learned to have a conscience.
Let's talk about Afghanistan, because that obviously was the book, your most recent book. The way the book goes is you start with, before you do the preface, and then you start with your earliest dispatches from around the time of 2001, when the United States became involved there again, and to the withdrawal in 2021, exactly 5 years ago tomorrow, I believe.
Yeah.
And it's illuminating and depressing to read the progression or lack thereof of United States involvement. What was your first? I think you went there shortly after 9/11, and
Yes.
you begin talking about some of the leading figures in Afghanistan at that time, and what was happening. Tell us about those early times. Did you sense any, at the time, do you think you had any feeling that the United States involvement could make a difference?
It's such a good question. Just to remind you that I also had been in Afghanistan 11, 12 years before, as the Soviets were pulling out at the end of their 10-year war, in which, a couple of millions of Afghans died. And you had the rise of the jihadis supported by the Americans, Pakistanis, and Saudis that included, Osama bin Laden eventually, began to pour into that place as a battleground. I went there on two extended trips in 88 and 89. And so I had a sense of this country, but from the battlefield. And then I went away, and of course, the world turned away as Afghanistan succumbed to civil war, the rise of the Taliban, 9/11, and then we came back. I felt on the day the Twin Towers were attacked, I was sitting in Spain and felt that I knew that it was probably Osama bin Laden based on some of his actions and statements. And I told the New Yorker I felt I should go to Afghanistan, that I was sure that we were going to go to war there. And sure enough, we did. They said, yes, go. And I went. This time, in a very different circumstances to 12 years before. Now, it's interesting because I went with the apocalyptic phenomenon that had been the attack on New York and Washington in my head, like so many other people. I had this idea of Afghanistan in the grips of these irredentist jihadi Taliban and their friends Al Qaeda who had pulled this off. And I came in from the north where some warlords who had been seeking Western backing now began to acquire it and began to fight against the Taliban from their little spur of territory they controlled on the northern border. And with CIA help and B-52 bombing from the United States, bombing the troop concentrations, the cities in Afghanistan began to fall as the Taliban essentially disappeared. They didn't sort of fight to the end, but they disappeared. Along the way in these battles, that where I was sort of watching them take place and then moving on to the next place, it was very sketchy. There was a sense, even behind anti-Taliban lines, of a kind of swirling anti-Western, quasi-jihadist sentiment. I had a number of encounters with fighters in the field. You didn't know where they were coming from, but they were hostile. And in each of these cases, I managed to come out of it okay. But there was a sense that you couldn't trust anyone, that you had to watch your back, and that this was a kind of roiling landscape in terms of its xenophobia, the fact that this was a land of that had only known warfare, that knew outsiders as infidels or something else. And even when we got to Kabul, the capital, which was, quote unquote, liberated by the Americans, there was still a sense of a kind of feral sense, especially in the outskirts. And so, I sought out some of the warlords that were now siding with the West in this onward battle to finish off the Taliban and reshape or reconquer Afghanistan. And it was a real mixed bag. One of them who had now sided apparently with the West and whom the Americans were allowing to control a huge territory on the outskirts of Kabul was in fact a former mentor of Osama bin Laden. And he seemed to me in our encounters to be an unreconstructed jihadist, very hostile. Um, so this began to show up in my pieces, the pieces I wrote for the New Yorker. I wouldn't ever say in those days, in 2001 and 2 and so on, that I thought that it was a doomed mission. I believed that the West would prevail. How could it not? It was both a righteous police action initially, and it was right for Afghanistan that these jihadis, be vanquished. That was certainly how I felt as a Westerner. And yet my experiences in the field, which again begin to pepper my chronicles of what I'm seeing, show they're seeded with doubt. And although I would say now, as I would have said, a year ago when I brought the book out, that I could not be clairvoyant and predict what happened. In those early years, I was concerned about what seemed to be a lack of application, a lack of interest, a lack of curiosity by the West and of the Americans who led the whole experience of truly engaging with Afghanistan. And within a year and a half, of course, we were diverted by the Iraq War, and I went there. I had this sense that the Taliban had not gone very far. And sure enough, I was there a lot in 2001 and 2. Then in 2002 and 3 and 4 and 5, I was in Iraq. The first time I come back is in 2005. And by then, the Taliban are coming back. And from then on, it becomes this inexorable story of their comeback. By 2010, I was predicting their eventual victory. I couldn't quite see how it would happen. But everywhere I went in Afghanistan, it was closing down. You really couldn't watch your had to watch your back then. The warlords that were supposedly allied with the Americans were sometimes doing double duty. We're two-timing them. I had a couple of experiences that where, we were attacked in the field by people that were supposedly allied with the Americans. You really couldn't trust. I'm not talking about average Afghans, but the authority figures in these regions where the Taliban clearly had formed what everybody was referring to as a shadow government.
In the book, there are some of the chapters or some of the pieces. I mean, you were not there with your trench coat somewhere in Kabul in a relatively safe place. You were embedded with small units of Marines outside the wire. You were being shot at, and bombs and bullets don't usually differentiate between the Marines and the journalists. So there were some really very scary moments to read in the book. For you and as well as for the others. One of the unusual things, it seems to me, about the Afghan fighting, which perplexed and disturbed Americans, was this idea of switching sides. And you just touched on it a little bit, but that in other wars, the Afghans sometimes were incredibly brutal to their opponents. At other times, they would say, come on over and lay down your arms and you can fight with us. And whole masses of soldiers would do that, which is not thought to be the American way, and we haven't seen that even in Iraq, it wasn't that way. The Shias and the Sunnis were not fighting for each other at that point. So how did Americans deal with this situation where one day they might be fighting with you and the next day against you?
Well, yes, eventually it became a real issue. In the beginning, of course, the Americans weren't really on the ground. They were bombing. There were CIA officers, operating or in special forces kind of behind the scenes with warlords. And those warlords were moving people around and making deals with people on the other side to join them and that kind of thing. I myself, I noticed all of this, but when it really was clarified for me was rereading Machiavelli's The Prince, probably 7 or 8 years ago. I had read it as a teenager, I think, and then I reread it. And what's fascinating is that the kind of warrior logic, amoral logic of war that Machiavelli describes taking place in medieval Italy is exactly what I had seen and I have always seen in Afghanistan. It's not about right or wrong. It's not about even who you're with. It's about winning. It's about how you prevail. If you must betray someone in order to prevail, it's what you do. There was one warlord in particular in medieval Italy that Machiavelli was, reserved special praise for. And this was a man who betrayed his allies, killed, thousands, but ultimately became out as top dog. And that was to be admired. And in a sense, that's ultimate warfare. That is war in Afghanistan. That's how it's played. There are differences between clans, families, history, true enemies, that kind of thing, even ideology. But this more ancient form of warfare in which might makes right is really the one that played out on the ground. And I think it did bedevil the Americans. Once more American troops and then NATO allies began pouring into the country by the tens of thousands, they had different experiences around the country. And it was largely kept hermetic, but if you were there, you would find out things about how the Brits were faring in their area, or the Germans, or the Americans for that matter. And by 2008 and 9 and beyond that, there was increasing numbers of what I think they're called green on blue attacks or green on green attacks. What were those? That was attacks, murders of American, Canadian, British, German soldiers and officers by their allies in uniform, Afghans. Now, were those Taliban in disguise in some cases? Yes. Or were they simply Afghan nationalists who couldn't bear any longer to be ordered around by by a foreign national who they saw as an imperial invader. Maybe a combination of all of them. But there were hundreds of those attacks, and I think significantly more than any other modern conflict. So by 2010, 11, I remember going to a base in the eastern Afghanistan, small, what they call a combat outpost, where there was a small group of young American soldiers led by a captain, a young guy, you know, educated, well-intended, and it turned out that the Afghans who with whom they were supposed to share this space, that they couldn't talk to each other. There was almost they had almost been a murder, and it had to do with one of the Americans had um, one of the Afghans had a cat, and he had, I think he had shat on the American's sleeping bag, something like that. The American wanted to kill the cat, and as a result, they nearly came to blows. And when I say blows, it became a real issue, and there was real worry that someone would be murdered. And during the days I was with them, I was the only person who could move between the two sides within a base. The Taliban were out there, Al Qaeda was there, but within the base, you could cut the air with a knife. And when we went out on patrol, the Americans believed that the scouts they had somehow betrayed them and were in league with the Taliban. There was complete lack of trust. And that was the piece I wrote, I think early 2011, where, the subtitle was, is it time to leave Afghanistan? And I did predict that the Taliban were inevitably going to retake the country because the Americans were nowhere. They were cooped up in these little bases or big bases. They moved around in helicopters, and whenever you moved through towns or villages or on the roads with them in these armored vehicles, you could see the looks they got. It felt like being with Martians who'd invaded planet Earth.
And you talk about this in the book. It is a gigantic country geographically. It is one of the poorest and most illiterate countries in the world. Different than, for example, Iraq and Iran, which have had, very educated population in many parts of those countries. And foreign invaders, whether they be British or Soviets, and now the Americans, have repeatedly been thrust out. And there is a basic feeling that, insular feeling in Afghanistan, that it's not part of the larger world, and that anyone who comes in is seen as an invader, I suppose. There's another country, you mentioned peripherally Pakistan, which clearly was aiding the Taliban for many years and now is paying a price for that. But we flooded Pakistan with money and arms, and much of that was being funneled to the Taliban. Why did we keep doing that?
It's such a good question. Look, this was something from the very early days in the war. When we all went up to Tora Bora, to where the special forces were supposedly going to get Osama bin Laden. Tora Bora is in the mountain range bordering Pakistan. Well, he got away. And it was pretty clear from everything the few reporters that were around could tell, was that he had gotten away with the support of some local warlords. This had been an area where he'd made strong for over many years, and with the Pakistani authorities. He was now inside Pakistan, and over the years, you would talk to American diplomats or others and say, why aren't we going after the jihadis, bin Laden and other groups that were allied with the Taliban in Pakistan? And there was never an effective answer. But my understanding evolved to the following extent. The United States was very aware that Pakistan, on the one hand, was an ally, and yet on the other hand was an adversarial country, and that part of its intelligence and military services supported this anti-Western jihad that had attacked us and continued to, and in fact sometimes bombed or murdered Americans in Pakistan, not just in Afghanistan. but they engaged with the part of the state where they had, um, ambassadors wearing suits and ties, much like you're wearing today, Louis, or those military men that they believed were on the West Side. But it was this kind of schizophrenic culture, schizophrenic society that they had to tread carefully with, because after all, Pakistan had become a nuclear state. In fact, the man who had given North Korea, Libya, Iraq, and the nuclear know-how was none the less than a nuclear scientist in Pakistan who, under American pressure, was being held in a kind of house arrest, but never truly imprisoned for what he'd done. So this nuclear proliferation we've also seen over the years, and which led, Bush and others to talk about weapons of mass destruction. And of course, actually, a lot of it can be laid at Pakistan's door. So I think, history will be full of analysts trying to figure out if we could have done things differently with Pakistan. The fact of the matter is, we never dealt with the source of the problem, which was the jihadist support from within Pakistan itself, and tried to deal with the symptoms, or exercise pressure on the tame part of the Pakistani state that was not pro-jihadist. But Pakistan, since its inception, has practiced what a few countries over the years have practiced, which is what they call strategic depth, which is, it's a very neurotic country. It was carved out of India, out of the Raj, as a Muslim state. And in the years since then, it has supported terror and terror groups in its surrounding neighbors because it feels weak in order to protect itself. So rather than engaging positively in its neighbors' territory, it weakens them through terror. In the case of Kashmir, and in the case of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And like you said, the chickens have kind of come home to roost, because as always with these groups, there's more radical Taliban who formed in an ISIS breakaway, and there's also an originally Pakistani intelligence formed group that is also a kind of Pakistani Taliban that wants to convert Pakistan itself, and it's receiving support from the Taliban in Afghanistan. So, yeah, it's created so many Frankensteins that Pakistan is at risk of succumbing to its own
Let
the
me step
monsters of
back
its
for a
own
minute.
creation.
We've got about 10 minutes. I want to step back for a minute. In the book, you've obviously been in so many situations, both in Afghanistan and around the world, where your life was at risk. You saw horrific things around you. Among people, yourself and others who do what you do, is there a form of things that you carry home in the sense of, if not PTSD, just sort of the things that you carry?
I've always, well, I think I've got that under control. I say that, in a kind of qualified way, because I recognize that I've gone through what I would call dark periods before. How did they manifest themselves? Usually with a hot temper. I tried never to bring that home. I mostly didn't, but I would have altercations en route with waiters or people in airports or in shops that I felt were being rude to me. And I later on now, of course, I recognize that as a kind of PTSD. When you emerge from an environment where it's all about life and death, regular society can seem really frivolous, and rudeness can be misinterpreted. I think it's similar for people that come out of prison. This idea that you must show respect, and if you don't, it's a life or death situation. Um, so I learned to be careful about that. And this usually would kick in when I'd been in, say, usually Iraq for several months, Afghanistan too, but Iraq was particularly fraught there. Every day one was in Iraq for a long period of time, one's life was at risk, and you were very aware of it. So it was difficult not to have some kind of consequence. What a number of us did, I'm talking about fellow reporters, was we would come out usually through Jordan, which we called kind of jocularly the kingdom of boredom, because nothing happens there. And we would stay for 2 or 3 days in a hotel in Amman and, sort of hang out, have meals, get ourselves cleaned up, and just sort of defuse and then go home. And it was something we did without really planning it or talking about it. But I recognize eventually that, instinctively we were trying not to carry baggage home. Um, I have a family and my kids were growing up. They were pretty young when I was going through all of this. So also, you don't tell them everything. I would get on a sat phone and talk with them every day that I could, but I'd usually try to make it a conversation about their daily lives rather than mine, you know. And I think that's also, for me, that was healthy, that was salubrious to be connected with the kids and my wife and, be in touch with what really was important in my life, which was my family.
Well, you were fortunate
And
to have them. I'm sure that for those who don't have those kind of anchors, it might have been even more difficult.
that's right. That's
The,
right.
I mean, you do talk in the book at the last chapters about the American withdrawal, which became 5 years ago tomorrow, as we've mentioned. We don't have time to go into that, either Donald Trump or Joe Biden's decisions regarding that. But what we do know is that a lot of people were left behind. Some managed to come out, Afghans who had helped America. A lot were left behind. Obviously, the women and girls in Afghanistan are struggling terribly at this point. We have a pretty robust Afghan refugees resettlement program here in Vermont, proud to say. But for individuals who would like to help people in Afghanistan, is there any particular organizations you would recommend or ways that they can be involved where they feel they really their money or contributions would be of real value?
Gosh, I mean, right off the top of my head, Luis, no, I don't, it, because I'm aware, I'm in touch with Afghans who to this day are trying to get out and desperate to leave, or because of their children or girls or whatever. And it's been a real problem, and not least because of the anti-immigration temperament and policies enacted by the Trump regime. And they've been particularly hostile towards Afghans, but Muslims generally. It's a problem. I believe that there are some organizations that particularly help women. I'll follow up with you so that maybe you can uh, publish them when this comes out. But I'm unclear exactly at this point. It's also an issue of what's public, because my understanding is that there's a kind of very, very xenophobic, tyrannical part of the Taliban that have decreed these strictures against women, and then there's a group that is allowing them to have underground schools and so on. It's unclear to me how public one can be about this, if you know what I'm trying to say. Yeah. But there are NGOs, there are people who do work and try to get books and funds and so on to basically women and girls who have no choice but to stay there and are trying to be educated despite their confinement.
If you
That's
were the
about it.
United States president today, knowing what we know and knowing all that you know about Afghanistan, what would you do right now in regards to Afghanistan?
Look, I would engage with the Taliban. I say that with caution, but I would engage. It's a fait accompli. They control the country. The country is not at war at the moment. They have committed all kinds of criminal acts and they have been tyrannical, but they are not a monolith. And we have learned, to our great regret and to the world's great regret, not to ignore Afghanistan as we have in the past. It's not a problem that will go away if we turn our backs on it.
That billions of dollars in assets that are being held?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, I wouldn't go so far as to say that the billions of dollars in assets that are held should be dispersed to the Taliban. At the very least, I think we need to begin a conversation.
Well, conversation is what you've had throughout your career in so many places in the world. While you were dodging bullets, you still managed to hold conversations, which is, I feel, you should have received every literary award there is. But I want to thank you. I want to wish you safety in all of your future ventures. We really appreciate you being here with us today on Meet the Author. And the book again is To Lose a War, The Fall and Rise of the Taliban by Jon Lee Anderson. If you want to know about Afghanistan, this is the book to read. So thank you for being with us, and thank you for being with us to our audience, and please join us next time on Meet the Author.